Prophet, leader and lawgiver, Moses led the Jews to the Promised Land and gave them a higher body of law, the Ten Commandments. Arthur Balfour prophesied a Jewish state and promised Jews a national home in a declaration that has come to be seen as a higher law, a law that constitutes the foundation of the State of Israel, the inspiration for a Jewish state, and the justification for the settlement of Judea and Samaria, that is the West Bank. The time has come to place this declaration in a perspective. We need say little about the author. Much has been said about him this morning. Suffice it to say, Arthur Balfour was an imperialist who was responsible for the suppression of human rights in South Africa and India and Ireland. In Ireland, he was known as Bloody Balfour. He was not a popular figure, and he was not a success either as Prime Minister or as Foreign Minister. Today he is only remembered because of the Balfour Declaration. It's important to stress that the Balfour Declaration was a political statement, not a legal statement. It was intended to serve two purposes, as we've heard this morning. The first purpose was to win the support of Jews in Russia and the United States for the war effort. And secondly, it was designed to provide an alternative destination for Jewish immigration, which would spare the United Kingdom. But today it is seen as an authoritative statement with legal consequences. That is the way Israel likes to see it. But this is not the position. At the very best, it was an aspiration, a statement of policy. It is unilateral declarations made by politicians in authority can on occasion create legal obligations. For instance, in 1974, the French president declared at a press conference that France would discontinue atmospheric nuclear tests in the South Pacific. And the International Court of Justice held that this created legal obligations for France, and that Australia and New Zealand, who were complaining about these atmospheric nuclear tests, could hold France bound by this statement. But the Balfour Declaration was not such a binding declaration, not such an undertaking. The language of the declaration was not that of obligation. Britain only viewed, quote, with favour, unquote, the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And it undertook Britain to use best endeavours, quote, unquote, to achieve this object. Moreover, the Balfour Declaration was made at a time when Britain did not exercise control over the area of Palestine, and it clearly lacked the power to implement the undertaking. So the Balfour Declaration did not create an obligation for Britain to do anything, certainly did not oblige the Ottoman Empire to do anything, and it did not confer rights or obligations on anyone, least of all the Zionist movement. Surprisingly, when General Allenby triumphantly entered Jerusalem a month after the Balfour Declaration, he made no mention of the Balfour Declaration. Clearly he viewed it as significant and not worth mentioning, and we don't even know whether he knew of its existence at all when he entered Jerusalem. The fact that the Balfour was a statement without legal consequences means that there is no way in which it can be challenged in a court of law. It was a political statement that requires a political response. However, the Balfour Declaration did achieve legal significance when it was included in the mandate for Palestine. Article 2 of the mandate made Britain responsible for putting into effect the Balfour Declaration. But the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine by the mandatory power of the United Kingdom was subject to two qualifications. First of all, in terms of the mandate, Britain was obliged to safeguard the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race or religion. And second, and perhaps more important, Article 22 of the Covenant made it clear that the administration of the mandate was to be a, quote, sacred trust of civilization. The covenant from which the mandate derived superior norm. This meant that the commitment of the mandate to a national home for Jewish people was subordinate to the principle that the well-being and development of the people of Palestine was a sacred trust of civilization. And it's important to stress that the International Court of Justice, in two cases, one involving Namibia and the other involving the construction of the wall in Palestine, has held that the ultimate object of the sacred trust was the self-determination and independence of the people concerned, that is, the Palestinian people as a whole, and not only Jews who had made their home in what was then Palestine. It's important to stress that the mandate did not provide for Palestine to become a Jewish state. All it contemplated was a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Britain was not authorized to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, and the legal to which Britain was accountable made it very clear it did not contemplate the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Today, Israel argues that the State of Israel was created pursuant to the Partition Resolution of the General Assembly of 1947, and that this gave effect to the Balfour Declaration. In other words, it is suggested that these two instruments, the Partition Resolution and the Balfour Declaration, legitimized and created the State of Israel. And this, of course, explains why Balfour is today seen in Israel as one of the founding fathers of the State of Israel. But, of course, this is nonsense. The State of Israel was not created either by the United Nations, by the Partition Resolution, and nor was it created by the Balfour Declaration. It was created by a unilateral act of secession on the part of the Jewish community from the State of Palestine, strongly backed by armed force. In other words, it was a unilateral act of independence, very similar to that made by Ian Smith in Rhodesia in 1965. I think it's helpful to compare the Israeli UDI and the Rhodesian UDI. In the case of Rhodesia, we know that a small white minority unilaterally declared independence in the face of opposition from the black majority and proceeded to impose its will on the black majority by forcible means. In the case of Israel, a Jewish minority comprising 53% of the population of Palestine unilaterally declared independence in the face of opposition from the Arab majority, proceeded to impose its authority over 78% of the land by forcible means. The Security Council condemned Rhodesian independence and declared that it was illegal because it violated the principle of self-determination. Israel, on the other hand, was immediately by the United States and the Soviet Union and admitted shortly after to the United Nations. But like Rhodesia, Palestine was a self-governing territory subject to the rules relating to self-determination, and this meant that, judged by the precedent of the Rhodesian case, Israel should not have been recognized at all by states and should certainly not have been admitted to the United Nations. So we see that already at that time the double standard was applied in respect and in favor of Israel. Arguments are today raised in Israel that Israel's settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem can be justified by the Balfour Declaration on the ground that they provide a home for the Jewish people. I suspect that the Balfour Declaration was in the mind of David Friedman, the US ambassador to Israel, when he proclaimed earlier this week that only 2% of the West Bank was occupied by Israel, as the international community had always intended that Israel should be allowed to keep most of the land that it had occupied in 1967. I fear that when, as I suspect it will, Israel annexes Area C of the West Bank, it will again invoke the Balfour Declaration as a justification for its action. And I fear that when it does annex Area C, the British government will not oppose it on the ground that the revered prophet Arthur Balfour promised the West Bank to the Jews as their national home. Of course, this is nonsense. The Balfour Declaration is not law. It has no legal consequences. It is not a type of 11th commandment that overrides international law. It does not justify the seizure of Palestinian land by means of the wall. It does not justify the settlement of some 700,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It does not authorize the destruction of Palestinian homes in West Bank and East Jerusalem. And it does not justify the creation of a settlement empire in Palestine, which practices both colonialism and apartheid. Of course, there's no harm in commemorating the Balfour Declaration, but this commemoration should not take the form of a celebration. Rather, I suggest it should take the form of a mourning for the failure of the Balfour Declaration to create a national home for the Jewish people with respect for the rights of the majority of the population. We all know that instead of creating this type of home, the Balfour Declaration has created a very different kind of state. It has created a state that has unlawfully annexed territory that it has acquired by force, a state that has brutally occupied the remaining 22% of the Palestinian territory for 50 years, and a state that has applied a policy of apartheid to the occupied territory. This morning, Peter Shamrock said that there was no definition for apartheid. Well, there is a definition for apartheid. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court clearly defines apartheid. It requires three features of an apartheid state. First of all, there should be two people. In this case, there are Jews and Arabs or Palestinians. Secondly, that there should be inhumane acts committed by the one group against the other group. This has clearly been the case in respect of Israel's treatment of Palestinians. And thirdly, the one group should dominate and oppress the other group, and this is clearly the case in respect of the occupied Palestinian territory. In effect, in the occupied Palestinian territory, we see two communities living together, the settler community of over 700,000 Jews and the Palestinian population, the minority community, like the white minority in South Africa, dominates the majority by means of inhumane acts. So there is clearly an application of the policy of apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory. So that's what we should be talking about today. We should be talking about not the celebration of the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, about the crime, but instead about the crimes committed by Israel. We should be talking not about the origins of the State of Israel, but about its criminal conduct instead. Just let me say that it's very clear that Israel is only protected from prosecution before the International Criminal Court of Western European states, particularly the United Kingdom. Israel has clearly committed the war crime of establishing a settlement empire in the occupied territory. The facts are clear, the law is clear, yet for over 2 years the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has refused to make a decision to move from a preliminary examination to an investigation or prosecution. And you will ask the question, why not? And the answer is very clear, and that is that Western European states have made it very clear that they would not welcome such a prosecution. It's rumoured that the United Kingdom is one of the leading states in bringing pressure to bear of this kind. We're not clear that this is indeed the case, but I suspect that the United Kingdom has brought pressure on the prosecutor indirectly or even directly in order to prevent her from bringing a prosecution. Perhaps I'm wrong, but be that as it may, if the United Kingdom wishes to demonstrate its commitment to the cause of international justice, now is its opportunity on the centenary of the Balfour Declaration to publicly announce that it favours prosecution of Israel for its criminal conduct in establishing an apartheid state in the occupied Palestinian territory. End by talking about the statement by the British government that it is proud of its role in the creation of the State of Israel. And let me end by posing a hypothetical question to Mrs. May and the British government. In 1985, the South African apartheid regime celebrated the 75th anniversary of the creation of the Union of South Africa, in which the British government had played a major role. If Mrs. May had been Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1985, would she have invited President P.W. Botha to 10 Downing Street to celebrate the occasion? Would she have stated that the British government was proud of the role that the United Kingdom had played in the creation of the Union of South Africa and later the Republic of South Africa? I suspect not. But why not? South Africa violated fewer rules of international law and fewer rules of international human rights law and fewer rules of international humanitarian law than Israel has violated. And after all, I think it's fair to say that South African apartheid was no worse than that which prevails in occupied Palestine. Thank you.